Welcome to the Naval Postgraduate School Center for Homeland Defense and Security lecture and webinar series. On behalf of CHDS and our co-host today, the American Logistics Aid Network, Big City Emergency Managers, the Governor's Homeland Security Advisors Council, the International Association of Emergency Managers, the International City County Management Association, the National Emergency Management Association, the CHDS Alumni Association, and the Naval Postgraduate School Alumni Association and Foundation. Thank you for joining us. Today, we will continue our America in Transition webinar series, discussing what leaders need to know as we head into 2023. Today, our panel will examine the country's evolving homeland security threat, both domestically, and examine what foreign threats will mean for us here at home. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today's webinar. Russ Porter serves as a frequent lecturer here at the Center for Homeland Defense and Security. He was appointed as the Senior National Intelligence Service by the Director of National Intelligence in 2010. At ODNI, Russ serves as the Strategic Partnerships Lead and also works in the National Counterintelligence and Security Center. His leadership in the intelligence community at the state, national, and international level has helped transform the post 9/11 domestic security, information sharing, and intelligence landscape. Russ works very closely every day with local, state, and federal law enforcement and intelligence professionals, and he works to do so to ensure a better community and a safer and more secure America. Russ's experience at every level of government and the intel community has certainly brought a wealth of experience to today's conversations. Russ, thank you for moderating our discussions, and now I'll turn the program over to you.
Well, Dawn, thank you, and thanks to NPS and the Center for Homeland Defense and Security and your whole team, as well as thanks to our panelists and to all of you for joining us today. Never forget, December 7th, 1941, precisely 81 years ago today, foreign actors carried out an attack on U.S. soil at Pearl Harbor. In fact, at this precise moment, the bombing was just beginning to stop. That attack ushered in dramatic changes to the security establishment of the United States. 60 years later, on September 11th, 2001, foreign terrorist actors carried out attacks on U.S. soil. That attack also ushered in dramatic changes for the security establishment in the United States. In fact, it's really the reason every one of us is here on this webinar today. Never forget. But what lies ahead? Why is this happening? Why are we facing a security environment that is evolving? Things like targeted violence and mass casualty violence. Things like fentanyl and drug-related deaths. Election meddling. Disinformation campaigns. Divisiveness and sowing discord through social media. I can go on, but as we see, the threat environment here in the homeland is evolving. And so America is in transition. What's the global picture? And what do foreign threats mean to us here at home? I'm going to introduce our panelists who can help us think about the answers to those questions. And you can read their bios online, but allow me to briefly introduce them now. First, Mr. John Cohen. John is the former acting Undersecretary of Intelligence and Analysis, as well as the Counterterrorism Coordinator at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. He was also a direct advisor to the DHS Secretary and oversaw many high visibility programs there. Prior to joining the U.S. government, John worked in law enforcement and in state and local governments, where he advised governors, law enforcement, homeland security professionals, and others in multiple states. John has studied mass casualty attacks and is currently studying the impact of internet-based communication technologies on crime and homeland security and national security. Next, Dr. Seth Jones. Seth is an instructor at Naval Postgraduate School's Center for Homeland Defense and Security, sponsoring this webinar series. He's also the Senior Vice President, Harold Brown Chair, and Director of the International Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He's also developed a CHDS self-study course, Threats from Nation States, which I commend to all of you. His background in special operations of U.S. military forces and his expertise not only in counterterrorism, but in counterinsurgency, unconventional warfare, and covert action is extremely relevant to today's discussion and to what lies ahead. Finally, we'll also hear from Ms. Lori Duran, Director of the New Jersey Office of Homeland Security and Preparedness, who spent most of her career in an organization, CIA, that seeks to understand the plans, capabilities, and intentions of our nation's foreign adversaries. And she's brought that experience to the homeland in her current role in New Jersey. So if you follow the arc of these three introductions of our panelists, we've got John's background from the local and state levels moving into senior level positions at the Department of Homeland Security. We have Seth's background, a real expert in unconventional warfare, hybrid warfare, gray zone tactics, things being applied against the homeland today. And Lori, who spent most of her career in an organization, CIA, that seeks to understand the plans, capabilities, and intentions of our nation's foreign adversaries. And she is bringing that experience to the homeland in her current role in New Jersey. I can't wait to hear what they're going to say, but I'm going to have to wait because first, we're going to turn to a question we've asked all of you. Sarah, could you bring up the slide of the first question that we've asked? And if you haven't answered it, you can answer that question now. The question is, what threats concerned you most? And you can see 4 categories there: targeted violence, mass casualty events. The second, cyber and technology threats. The third, foreign and nation state threats. And finally, terrorism. And those rankings seem to be holding pretty steady. So with that, I'm going to ask our panelists to think about those results and move us to first John Cohen. John, 2 days ago, DHS Secretary Mayorkas was at the Center for Strategic and International Studies speaking to a group, and the title of his remarks was "The Convergence of National Security and Homeland Security." And he said, we face a very different world today than the one we faced nearly 20 years ago. You've said the same thing. And so could you walk us through kind of the history of what you've seen in your experience at the local and state levels in Homeland Security and at the federal level, kind of how the threat has evolved and what we've been doing for the last 20 years in Homeland Security?
Yeah, thanks, Russ. Great question. And first, let me just thank y'all for pulling together this discussion. I think it's critically important that we have this conversation, and I look forward to speaking with Seth and Lori and you, Russ, as we pull the thread on this issue. I go back to something that you said earlier in your introduction. In many respects, the counterterrorism and investigative infrastructure and approach that's been employed across the nation and across the globe dramatically changed after the attacks of September 11th. I started my career as a federal agent. I worked as a local police officer. And when I started my career almost 40 years ago, we didn't spend a lot of time thinking about the potential that a foreign terrorist organization would deploy operatives into the United States for the purposes of conducting attacks. There is some of that, but we had a lot of other national security and public safety issues that we addressed. But as I've held all my various jobs, I've sort of retained the mindset of a local cop, which is understand what's unfolding in front of you and then develop operational plans to address the threat as it's evolving in front of you. And the environment we're facing today, just 20 years after September 11th, is probably, and I've said this publicly before, the most complex, dynamic, and quite frankly, dangerous that I've experienced in the close to 40 years that I've been involved in law enforcement. Part of the complexity comes from the fact that once separate areas of threat activity have become intertwined. Oftentimes, it is difficult to place behaviors and activity that are discovered by intelligence analysis or through law enforcement investigations into those concrete definitional categories that guide investigative protocols or allow us to place behaviors into context. But we are also seeing a commingling of the digital environment as well as the physical environment. State and non-state actors continue to harness the power of the internet to support a broad range of asymmetric activities in furtherance of illicit, security-related, public safety, and intelligence-related activities. I mean, think about this for a second. Malicious cyber activity as well as malign information operations are increasingly being used at times in an integrated manner by foreign governments or their proxies in furtherance of a term you use, Russ, gray zone or hybrid warfare activities by state actors hostile to the United States. They're seeking to project power, and they're using a broad range of asymmetric strategies beyond conventional military confrontation to do so. But we're also seeing non-state actors, foreign terrorist organizations, domestic extremists, using these same information operation playbooks. They promote socio-political narratives and other content conspiracy theories in an effort to inspire ideologically motivated attacks, most recently directed at government officials, law enforcement officers, or others in our society or facilities associated with race, ethnicity, political, or religious beliefs of the intended target. Further complicating this dynamic is when we see foreign intelligence services amplifying this online content to advance their own operational objectives. Hostile foreign powers continue to target the US, its critical infrastructure, its democratic processes, in an effort to disrupt our elections, but more broadly to sow discord, to destabilize our society, undermine confidence in democratic institutions, disrupt our relationship with key allies. They will use a combination of cyber intrusions, and data extraction, as well as content development in order to advance those objectives. And even further complicated, human smuggling and other criminal organizations have adopted the same information operations playbook. And we see groups like human smuggling organizations using these same social media or internet-based communication platforms as they seek to groom individuals to engage, to become part of international sex trafficking operations, narcotics operations, or even to inspire mass migratory movements. I mean, let me just take a second to talk about the issue that was raised in the questions about targeted violence, domestic terrorism, and foreign terrorism. Because if you look at the threat in the United States today, the terrorism-related threat, we are in the midst of a multi-year trend which includes sustained levels of mass casualty attacks and other acts of targeted violence, primarily by lone offenders, sometimes small groups. But essentially, as described by an assistant director of the FBI several years back, by a subset of our society who have come to believe that violence is an acceptable way to express their sense of anger, their sense of grievance, their individual ideological beliefs. Violence is an acceptable way to express disagreement on matters of policy, politics, and government actions, or to resolve disputes, whether it's between people in a workplace or opposing street gangs or domestic partners. And in every case that we researched over the last 10 years, we have found that these attackers have derived inspiration, validation, and tactical knowledge from content they discovered or consumed online. We've seen some recent analysis, such as that out of the New York State Attorney General's office, which looked at the Buffalo attack, that has indicated that in many cases, these violent actions that are being experienced in communities across the country are fueled by an online and media ecosystem that is saturated with conspiracies and other socio-political content that's specifically placed there by foreign and domestic threat actors, including hostile intelligence services, foreign terrorist organizations, criminal organizations, and domestic violent extremists. The content is introduced, it's amplified and spread in an effort to sow discord, undermine confidence in government and democratic institution, and inspire acts of violence. These threat actors seek to exploit divisive social and political issues in developing this content. They will also, and more recently, we've seen quite a bit of reporting on this, there is extensive promotion of tactics that can be used in conducting attacks and extensive online content that focuses on what facilities, what communities, and what government personnel should be the target of these attacks. So as we look toward the future, and as we just begin discussing today what we should be doing about it, the first thing I would say is we need to have a shared appreciation and understanding of how the threat environment has evolved. And sessions like this are critically important in gaining that understanding. But we also need to think very hard about how we look at intelligence. You know, when I started working at the ODNI, there was this general cultural attitude that the value of information was also often determined by the sensitivity of the collection platform. But today what we're learning is that intelligence that's vital to preventing attacks may be on public forums. And in fact, in many cases, the intent of the threat actor promoting that content is to have it spread as far and wide, even to the point where mainstream public figures in media and in government are amplifying those narratives. We also need to think about how we mitigate risks. Traditional law enforcement investigation, arrest, and prosecution tactics still have great validity, but we have to look at broadening our toolbox. Sometimes the best way to prevent an ideologically motivated attack would be through community engagement, mental health support, and other non-traditional law enforcement activities. So I go back, Russ, to saying this is why this is such a complex environment, because in many respects, I sort of look back towards the days when I started my law enforcement career and think about how much simpler things were back then because the problems were easier to define.
Yeah, it seemed much easier. You described what former DNI Clapper used to call the litany of doom with so many things going on. It makes it hard to think about, hard to really sort out, okay, how do we approach this? And what's the bigger context in which these things are occurring? How do we understand that? And I want to turn now to Seth. And Seth, I've listened to you speak. It has helped me understand this broader context in a world, since I come from the homeland, that I really never thought about, and I've learned I need to. And that is this whole idea that we're not necessarily prepared. I think you've written we're woefully unprepared to address the future of global competition, which I didn't understand. Can you help us give the context for that global competition and what lies ahead in that arena?
Sure. Russ, thanks for your great question. Thanks for moderating this. And thanks to John, Lori, and the Center for Homeland Defense crew, including Dawn, that helped put this together. So the way I look at this is we all can take a step back for a moment. And as John mentioned, that we are in a very competitive, not just environment within the United States, including a polarized one, but we're in a very competitive national security environment overseas. And one way to be blunt about this so that we kind of recognize the situation we're in is to highlight briefly examples from both the Russians and the Chinese, and then I'll walk through very briefly some of the threats I think that we need to be aware of on the homeland. So first is, if we look at the Russians in Ukraine, it has not gone unnoticed to Vladimir Putin, to the head of the Russian main intelligence director, the GRU, the SVR, Russia's external intelligence agency, that U.S. weapons systems, U.S. Intelligence, as well as U.S. training has led to the deaths of tens of thousands of Russian soldiers, including a number of general officers, and has generally prevented the Russians from overrunning the government in Ukraine led by Zelensky. So the United States has been extremely helpful to the Ukrainians, but I think what we have to internalize is that we have then directly contributed to the deaths of more Russian soldiers, including general officers, than it appears they've lost in any war since World War II combined, and that includes their campaign in Afghanistan in the 1980s. The second is the Chinese, how much they are invested in Taiwan right now, and having an American president say multiple times over the last couple of months that we will go to war over Taiwan. Now, whether that happens or not, I think the reality is we're in a very competitive environment where war is either ongoing right now in Eastern Europe, or the timelines that we're now hearing. I just saw the 4-star commander of the U.S. Air Forces in the Indo-Pacific on Friday, and their timelines for war are declining, meaning they're getting closer. So I think that environment is important for us to understand. And why does this matter for the homeland? Because I think that concerns about conventional war between nuclear powers, the Russians and the Chinese are both nuclear powers, actually ends up being low just because of the horrific consequences. So what that has tended to do historically, and I think what we're already seeing, is that tends to push the activity, the malign activity of these kinds of countries down into the arena below the threshold of conventional war, what you may call asymmetric or gray zone or irregular activity. And that really briefly is what I wanted to highlight, because that is where we are seeing a massive increase in activity on U.S. soil from a range of actors. We can talk more specifics as we get going, but just to highlight with the Chinese, and we heard this at the most recent 20th National Congress, which elected Xi Jinping to a third term. Haven't seen that for multiple chairmen. I have to go back, I think it's to Mao, actually, the last Chinese leader that was elected to 3 terms. But we're seeing an increasingly aggressive China, where if we look at Chinese activity on digital platforms, we're seeing much more aggressive attempts to influence domestic audiences in the U.S., much more aggressive cyber espionage. And these aren't just targeting U.S. government agencies at the federal level, but at the state and local levels as well, which is, I think, critical to understand, including for elections. So this isn't just trying to steal information. This is targeting our democratic institutions. We've seen an increase with the Russians on the judiciary as well. The entire concept from the Chinese of the 3 warfares, public opinion, psychological warfare, and legal warfare, are all to manipulate foreign audiences in ways that benefit the Chinese and weaken the U.S. as part of balance of power competition. So we've seen that on disinformation on multiple platforms from the Chinese. These are People's Liberation Army, PLA actors, MSS, Chinese intelligence, and a range of other organizations operating on U.S. platforms. I think all of us probably on this call have been impacted by hacks, including the Office of Personnel Management and Equifax, which impacted half of Americans. We're continuing to see concerns at some universities with not just Confucius institutes that have essentially prevented democratic discussions on issues that are controversial to the Chinese, but we see active attempts to influence Chinese on campuses or to steal sensitive technology on campuses. And we've seen that in the corporate world as well, significant pressure on Hollywood companies, the National Basketball Association. And on the Chinese, probably worth noting very briefly that the 2 top box office movies now in Chinese history, the second one is Wolf Warrior, a war against the United States and Africa, and the second is The Battle at Lake Changjin, another war against the United States, this one in the Korean Peninsula. So that is what they are signaling to their domestic population. And the Russians, we can get into this more broadly, but again, lots of activity on the Russian side. We've seen Russian linked actors involved in targeting our pipeline system, including Colonial Pipeline, impacting a range of U.S. corporations, disinformation on U.S. platforms, not just with the elections, but on every major issue that has been controversial in the United States. So let me conclude with we hosted the DHS secretary earlier this week, and it's this combination of Homeland and international security that we extensively talked about, not just in the open forum, but privately when we spoke to him. And I think what I'll highlight lastly is in the polls that everybody got here, what I find particularly interesting is that as we look at categories like terrorism, cyber activities, state actors, how much overlap we see in all of those categories. We have seen Russian influence, including on violent far-right activity. We've seen Chinese cyber operations. The overlaps in all of these areas are significant. And I think they are highly likely to get even more concerning as competition ramps up globally. So with that very positive end, Russ, I'll turn this back to you.
Thanks. I recall at UT Austin when you said this competition is going to become intense, and then you punctuated that statement by repeating the word intense. And it really drove home the point for me that, we're in a different place, and Homeland Security professionals should think about this and think about how we should evolve. And as I turn to Lori here, and maybe make a little segue from a defense perspective and national security and global security perspective, I remember that the National Military Strategy of the United States in 2015 said, in time, nation-state actors will threaten the homeland. That was 2015. In time, they'll threaten the homeland. 3 years later, in 2018, that strategy said it is now undeniable the homeland is no longer a sanctuary. America is a target. And so as we think about this hybrid gray zone tactics of election meddling, disinformation, as John said, information operations, I turn to Lori, who has had a great career with the agency and now applying her background and knowledge to, hey, how do we deal with this in a state or local government area? So Lori, your thoughts on kind of what this means for state and local governments and what do we do about it?
Well, thank you very much, Russ. Thank you for the question. It's a good question. And I'm very happy to be here with both John and Seth. And I very much appreciate the invitation to be here from the center. Again, I bring a slightly different background than my colleagues with regard to my background. At CIA, I worked as an operations officer, which essentially means that I recruited spies for a living to help give information on behalf of their countries to help the U.S. government clandestinely. And with that, I've been able to utilize my 32 years of working overseas and understanding foreign intelligence services and seeing how that can be working here in the States. I wanted to put up a quick graphic. The reason that I put this up here, because I wanted to talk a little bit about how, from the state perspective, because I'm wearing, I wear the hat as a Homeland Security Advisor for the governor, and I have the background that I came into, more on the international foreign relations side of the house and foreign intelligence, but also I'm wearing the hat now for state and local. And so in our organization, what we assess as the top threats for New Jersey, which would also be a lot of them would be the same for other states, would be, homegrown violent extremists, white racially motivated extremists, cybersecurity threats. But with that, we also need to put in there the counterintelligence threat from nation state actors. And I know a lot of people, I'm saying it right here as one who's an adopted New Jersey, and people say about New Jersey, there's nothing there that anybody cares about, just go on the turnpike, keep on going. I can tell you there's more here than that. But what I wanted to show in this graphic is, why would a foreign intelligence service be interested in a place like New Jersey? Again, as someone who was an intelligence officer, who recruited people and looked at their countries and their nations. We have a lot of the same things here that a foreign intelligence service would want to collect, just like I did overseas. So I just wanted to show this here about how, in particular of New Jersey, 40% of the U.S. population is around, within a day's drive of New Jersey. I'm not going to read the entire script off here, but it just gives you an idea of little New Jersey that nobody really thinks about, has a lot of things in there, both on the infrastructure side and in terms of international organizations and research organizations and just basically its geographical location. We have the largest density per square mile in the United States in terms of people. We have a wide diversity of individuals from various backgrounds. And with that, we have been classed by the FBI, at least in recent years, as the number two, basically for a foreign intelligence service, we're number two in terms of wanting to collect information and espionage target. California would be number one. Thank you for showing that slide. So with that, like I said, I'm kind of wearing a little bit of two hats. I focus a lot, of course, on counterintelligence because that is my comfort zone in that. But we have to, as a local and state entity, we have to look at that. And so what we've been trying to work on here in New Jersey is to developing, working with our federal partners, but also we are trying to have our own capability to do that. And we're fortunate in that, we have developed a counterintelligence and foreign influence, capability here in New Jersey. We are the first in the nation that has a official relationship with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, who have our detectives and our analysts who sit side by side with their FBI counterparts working on counterintelligence issues. As many of you probably have heard when we talk about terrorism, about the Joint Terrorism Task Force. What we have here also is the Counterintelligence Joint Task Force, which is now the FBI has asked that in the 56 field offices around the US of the FBI to have that some type of that kind of setup be there for state and local partners. So with that, we are doing, working in tandem with our FBI partners on investigations and analysis, excuse me, but also we work on things that are also things that don't necessarily meet the threshold. We also work on trying to help people be prepared, whether that's a private sector entity or the public. And so what our office also offers training and coordination and planning and exercise for various public and private sector entities and for the general public. We also look at our counterintelligence, our partners in the private sector. We have very close relationships with some of the leading organizations here that would have the highest threat, such as utilities, infrastructure, or organizations that fall under critical infrastructure. So we also do a lot with working with behavioral threat assessment teams. That's a concept that I know my colleagues who worked in DHS have asked us to work on, on a state-by-state basis. So we're working with our federal state partners as well as community partners to try and see if we can find people ahead of time before they become another person from Buffalo who shoots people up. It's an ongoing program, and essentially the threat has to evolve. We have to evolve with the threat. As Russ and my colleagues have said, what happened, 20 years ago is not the same thing that's happening now. We talk about, foreign terrorism, 9/11. With that now, that is still a threat here in New Jersey and around the country, but a lower threat doesn't mean that it's not a threat. And that's where you talk about homegrown violent extremists. And for example, unfortunately, we have had recently, some of you might have heard in the news of an individual who is a follower of ISIS, who's a homegrown violent extremist, who threatened synagogues throughout the state. That was earlier this last month. And so we have to take that seriously. And essentially what we do in our organization, we view ourselves as first preventers and not always first responders. And we're asking the public and, private and public sector entities to, as well as law enforcement, to try and, help us help you. We all can do it together. And with that, I will be quiet and hear what Russ has to say.
Laurie, thanks. And some of what I hear you say is there are areas that perhaps our Homeland Security thinking or frame of reference, we need to look beyond the traditional issues we've looked at as you've done an analysis, kind of a laydown of the state of New Jersey and the infrastructures that are there, and think about them in different ways, the industries that are there, the the technologies that are being produced there or that are being researched there, things that would be of interest. And so does that mean we can stop looking at terrorism?
Absolutely not.
And there was less interest on the first slide that we saw, at least today.
I mean, the threat remains there. We as I mentioned with the homegrown violent extremists, while we're not necessarily seeing the plots of of the ilk of 9/11 or something like that, those individuals from overseas are still influencing a lot of people. The pandemic caused a lot of problems, and one of the problems that it did cause is you had a lot of people who might have some background that maybe made them susceptible or vulnerable to being self-radicalized by watching ISIS videos online. Unfortunately, I wish I could say that New Jersey didn't have any of those people, but unfortunately we do, along with pretty much every other state in the union. And that with that, people, they had a lot of time, they had a lot of time to think. There were certain vulnerabilities that they had that made them susceptible to that. And then some of them decided on their own to act upon that. So while the foreign terrorist organization may not be the organization actually physically working here, they have other people who are willing to do it for them, and they're happy to take the credit, even if they're not the ones who are actually doing it.
So, John,
Russ, if I can jump in there, because this is a really interesting point, because I don't think it's a question of whether we should or should not be focusing on terrorism. I think the challenge facing those involved in law enforcement investigations and the analytic community is the terrorism threat has evolved. As investigators or analysts, we crave definitional categories, right? We need behaviors to fit into one of those categories that we're familiar with. But today, attacks are being conducted by people who self-connect with an ideological belief system, a blend of ideological belief systems, or a blend of ideological beliefs and personal grievances that they ultimately kludge together to serve as the justification for an act of violence. They want to use violence to express their anger at society or their own personal situation. They need a justification. They'll go online, spend a significant amount of time viewing content from white supremacist sites or anti-government sites or ISIS, Islamic State sites. And ultimately, when they come to the attention of law enforcement, it's hard to figure out, is this person ideologically motivated? Are they motivated by a foreign terrorist ideology or domestic extremist ideology? Is there unusual behavior, more a result of some personal grievance they may have or underlying mental health issue? And it's that back and forth, that inability to figure out what part of the salad bar, the person is choosing from that makes it so difficult. I mean, how many cases do we all know about where an individual, because of their behaviors, comes to the attention of law enforcement responds either through the work of a crisis intervention team and treats it as a mental health crisis, or it's a reference to the JTTF, but because it doesn't meet those traditional definitional categories, it's hard to determine whether it meets the threshold for a continued investigation or some other type of action. That's the challenge that we have to deal with, is that the threat today is not the threat of yesterday, and it's not going to fit into those same definitional categories, and it may not meet the threshold for further action by the Bureau or by law enforcement because the elements of those traditional crimes aren't present.
And so what do we do about that? I mean, a lot of people on listening today, watching today, they're planners, they're people in preparedness and focused on resilience. And I guess I'll turn this maybe to first to Seth, but any of you, when we think about things like solar winds or Colonial Pipeline, is there to some degree an inevitability to this? And should we be preparing differently, or should we be better with our resilience efforts so that the impact is less than what the adversary desires? Seth?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's obviously, we could spend another hour on answering that question, Russ. Just so a few points along these lines. One of them is, and I think the solar winds example is an interesting one too, is that we need to expect these kinds of attacks against critical infrastructure to happen. There will be, especially when we're dealing with very competent state-based actors, the Chinese or the Russians, they've got extraordinary capabilities on the cyber front that we just simply did not have on the terrorism front. They will be able to place malware in systems. They will be able to conduct some attacks. They're going to be deterred from some number as well. But I think what that requires us to do is a few things. One is to make sure that we are sharing as much as we can with the private sector, including some of these key targets. Those relationships, I deal a lot with chief security officers and run an advisory group that is major multinational US-based chief security officers. They are often very hesitant to report on activity going on within their companies because it's embarrassing. They don't want that information to get out, including their competitors. But those relationships become very important, I think, because they are in part going to be the targets of these kinds of attacks. And the same thing is on the redundancy side, is to understand that we've got to get back up and running and work with these companies to get back up and running relatively quickly. One of the things that's been fascinating about the Ukraine is they've had systems go down. They've gotten to the point where they're able to get systems generally on the electricity grid back up and running in a few hours now. So there's an ability to be redundant. And I think this is the same thing on the extremism side. We continue to keep a database of domestic terrorism attacks and plots. We're at historically high levels on attacks and plots, not necessarily on casualties and fatalities, but on attacks and plots. They're coming from across the spectrum, as John notes, from those on the what I'll call the violent far left, anti-fascists and anarchists, those on the violent far right, so white supremacists and some of the sovereign citizens, and finding ways to get ahead of those kinds of attacks, get back up and respond quickly when those attacks occurred, so that we're able to convey to the American public that we're back to business, that these kinds of extremist individuals or networks aren't going to win, I think is important. When you look at the data, again, we're at pretty high levels right now. And so we cannot stop every time an attack like this occurs. We need to find ways to mitigate and move on, be resilient.
That's a good, seems like a great emphasis. Partnerships, you've mentioned private sector partnerships. John, you've talked about partnerships. Lori, you as well, partnerships being so important, and new partnerships?
With regard to private sector?
Not only private sector, but other relationships. You've talked about the FBI.
Sure. We're fortunate here in New Jersey, being a small state allows us geographically to connect a little better, even if we're not in person, at least virtually. We have, again, on the federal, state, and local level, from a law enforcement perspective, we're in very close contact with our partners on law enforcement. Private sector, we have different organizations that get together and organizations that we have put together, such as a private sector advisory group, and then also even the interfaith community. Here in New Jersey, we have an organization that is coordinated by our office called the Interfaith Advisory Council, which has now currently, I'm happy to say, 4,000 members. And they're from all faiths throughout the entire state. It's a way for people to get together to talk about issues that might be of concern to them, also to share information. We provide training. We do in our office, we're responsible for the administration of the federal and the state Homeland Security grant program. So we also help provide a lot of details on how they can use that money and the training to help protect themselves, to help be the first preventers. And then if something does happen, to also help them get back on their feet very quickly. I wholeheartedly agree with Seth that basically we have to continue as business as usual, because then, the opponent wins. And we certainly don't want that to happen. So it's groups like that. And also just on the counterintelligence side of the house, we have focused mostly at this point more with our law enforcement colleagues and also with some of our private sector partners, colleagues. But what we're looking at doing here, at least in New Jersey, is we're now trying to roll that out a little bit more to the general public, to have them understand, like, talking to chambers of commerce and other business groups of where they can help us and themselves just to be a little more aware. And that comes down to education. It's not all the James Bond kind of things necessarily, that everybody thinks about. Like you said, some of it is, people are trying to take advantage of other people to try and collect technology, or steal technology. And as I think it was Seth that mentioned, China for us is the number one CI threat here in New Jersey. We have a lot of documented circumstances where they have been trying to steal technology. For example, during the pandemic with some of the COVID vaccines, 3 out of 5 of them were worked on here in New Jersey. So yeah, we have a lot of different groups like that, but we're always looking for different ways to make contact with the universities. Same thing. Again, I'm sure John and Seth have other comments on that too.
And so, John, thanks, Lori. And so, John, one final question to you, and then I'm going to ask Dawn if we can take this to some of the live questions. But on this private sector piece, not only partnerships to help them understand or to even provide insight, as Seth mentioned, we shared that information. But are there some things that the private entities can do that government maybe isn't as well suited for or as well organized for, that where they might be able to help in this mission in ways we haven't envisioned before?
Well, at the risk of not having my calls received or responded to by the government entities that I used to work with, I think on the analytical side of the house, there's tremendous research and analysis that's going on right now in the nonprofit world, in the non-government world relating to the current threat environment. And, I think back to my most recent stint at DHS, and I know in speaking to colleagues at the Bureau and within the intelligence community, there are a lot of roadblocks from an intelligence collection and analytic and dissemination perspective that makes it difficult for government entities to stay ahead of particularly the online elements of the current threat environment, which is fluid, rapidly evolving, often blends domestic and foreign activities. But in another way, I think there are elements of our society, some of them were mentioned, faith-based organizations, community-based violence prevention organizations, mental health professionals that are a critical part of our efforts to prevent the mass casualty attacks that are occurring way too often in communities across the country. And you have jurisdictions across the country now that have adopted decades-old strategies involving threat assessment investigations, threat management strategies. New Jersey is one of those states where when an individual is exhibiting behaviors that research and analysis has demonstrated to be associated with one traveling down the path toward violent activity, their behaviors can be assessed, and if appropriate, some type of multidisciplinary strategy intended to address those underlying factors contributing to the potential violent behavior can be employed, whether it's mental health, greater access to mental health, inpatient or outpatient mental health, working with the family, working with other social service organizations, the education system, employing temporary restrictions to that person's ability to access firearms. There's a whole slew of non-law enforcement, non-government partnerships that have demonstrated, when employed appropriately, a vast degree of effectiveness in preventing both ideologically and grievance-inspired acts of violence.
Sounds like more than ever a whole of society approach might be well worth considering. Dawn, can we go to you for live questions that might be out there?
Sure. Thanks, Russ. Seth, a series of questions have come in for you to ask you to speak to. What do you think the threat might be moving forward for a January 6th style of event, and maybe to also speak to some of the activity in Germany just this week and how that might have implications for how we analyze the threat picture here at home?
Great. So, I can start off just by talking about January 6th and other events along those lines. One of the interesting things is we put out at the beginning of every calendar year, so we'll do it in early 2023, a rundown of plots and attacks in the Homeland and other key themes that come out of our data. And two of the last years, one of the most striking evolutions was the percentage of attacks that were also occurring in the context of protests and demonstrations. So these were violent activities that, think about if folks remember their college days or graduate school days talking about game theory. This is what may be called the security dilemma, where individuals that go out into the street in an effort, in part, to protect themselves and arm themselves are also making others there feel insecure. And so they do the same. So we've seen in multiple cities in the United States, well-armed individuals coming together in close quarters and escalating a situation. That actually is one of my bigger worries, is there are lots of possibilities for protests and demonstrations in cities. They could be election related. They could be event related, January 6th related. They could be COVID related or economic related. They could, just more broadly be politically polarized issues, Supreme Court decisions that push people out into the streets and escalate a situation from individuals from opposing sides. We saw a big jump in our data last year from those on the anti-fascist and anarchist side, partly because they were coming to a range of demonstrations increasingly armed. So for me, that is, rather than a specific incident like people conducting an attack on the anniversary of January 6th, something that stirs large-scale anger. I mean, this is obviously in addition to what both John and Lori have talked about, individual incidents where people decide to conduct attack. This, congregations of people, and again, the data is the data across the U.S. This is not just Portland, Oregon, or Seattle, Washington. These are multiple cities. We've seen events over the last few years in Charlottesville, Virginia, in my home state, that escalated pretty quickly from individuals. But we're seeing more weapons coming into those kinds of incidents from people from very different political persuasions. So that has me definitely nervous based on data trends.
Russ, can I add to that for a moment? I mean, I think there's some other factors that we just need to put on the table on this issue. Contributing to the threat environment, I know in my conversations with police chiefs and sheriffs around the country, there's a number that share the view. We're a very angry and polarized nation. We have a growing subset of our nation that believes that violence is an appropriate way to express one's anger or disagreement with government policies and actions. The content we're seeing on accelerationist neo-Nazi forums calling for civil war, calling for armed conflict within the United States, calling for the assassination of elected officials, both Republicans and Democrats, calling for the assassination of law enforcement officers, has dramatically increased, particularly since January of this year. This content is highly graphic. One example would be a 52-second video with hard, heavy metal, rock and roll, a song called Kill the Police, which shows vignettes of police officers being assassinated. Accompanying that video is very detailed instructions on how to commit ambushes, how to engage in surveillance, and other information that is intended to inform tactical operations. This is the contents that's saturating the ecosystem. And in addition to that type of material, we're now beginning to see the mainstreaming of some of this and the mimicking of some of these narratives by mainstream figures. So the incentive or the inspiration for these attacks is out there. And I think that there's a number of things we need to start looking at societally about lowering the temperature in our political discourse. But law enforcement in their day-to-day operations have to have an understanding of these threat-related issues so that observations that they make on calls for service or self-initiated activity can be placed in the contents. I would just also add the FOP, Fraternal Order of Police, has found that at the same time we are seeing an uptick in this type of content, we are nationally experiencing an increase in ambush encounters between individuals in our communities and local law enforcement officers responding to call for service. So part of the analysis we need to do is there a cause and effect there? But we are in a very difficult threat environment right now. I don't want to sugarcoat it.
Just wanted to touch base a little bit about the what's going on in Germany. I mean, this is a prime example, which we have seen here in the U.S. and especially in the last few years of basically a blend of extremist ideologies. They want to go back and turn the clock back to 1871, which is the time of Kaiser Wilhelm, which means basically, a dictatorship. But at the same time, they also have some of the things they wanted to do or are said to have been wanting to do also strike me very much as sovereign citizens in what they're trying to do. And just the blend of individuals and ideologies there, ranging from a minor aristocrat and a judge in Berlin, military people, and just average citizens, throughout Germany, as well as some people in Italy and Austria. Again, it's a huge example, and they very much are interested in QAnon, which, I mean, who normally does, you don't think of Germany, you don't think QAnon, though we have seen here, in some of our analysis in the last year or so, where again, the blended ideologies, even of some of the people we've been focusing here on in New Jersey, it doesn't always have to make sense. It makes sense to them. While you might want to be Antifa on one side and Nazi on the other, you're kind of like, it's not logical, but we're not looking for logic here. So it's something that we have to consider, that it's all going to be kind of what Seth mentioned too. A lot of this is gray. It doesn't have to, it doesn't have to make sense to any of us who are in this business, but to them it makes sense. But trying to unpack that and to try and figure that out and to try to help, prevent that, or at least educate people on how this happens. It's a tall order. It's not easy, but luckily, I think I can speak on behalf of my colleagues. There are a lot of people, both, at all levels of the government, who are committed to try and keep all of us safe in whatever way, and to also try and educate the public to help us do that, because we can't do it all by ourselves.
Thanks,
Russ, can I just add one very quick comment just to amplify Lori's comments? Is one of the things that it's really been a little sad for me to testify a number of times before different Senate and House committees over the last year is how political those testimonies are. So I just continue to urge our Homeland Security professionals, stay objective, because it is a highly partisan, this subject is highly partisan. Stay objective. You will be doing our country service by staying objective, and don't get pulled into the partisanship in this, because I think it's too important to go down that road.
An important point, Seth. Thank you. Dawn, any?
Russ, we have one question, and being mindful of time, I'll throw it to Lori first, and certainly for Seth and John to jump in as well. Several viewers are new to their positions in local and state government, and have said that they have heard about foreign malign influence, but would have no idea what that might look like or how they would keep their eyes and ears out for that at the local or state level. Lori, any advice for local and state leaders for how they might recognize what's not apparent on its face, and then certainly for John and Seth, that they have something to add there?
I guess I would say, because I know in New Jersey, some of my colleagues around in other states have bits and pieces of the foreign malign influence counterintelligence piece together. I would start with your federal partners to get some of that information, to get some good intelligence briefings, to talk about, from nation state actor, and basically there's a lot of training that can come. I know here in New Jersey, we do provide training to our state and local partners with regard to counterintelligence, and we're at the beginning stages of that. Excuse me. We have something we call Regional Intelligence Academy, which is virtual as well as in person. It's where we talk about a variety of different topics, and one of them has been trying to recognize where perhaps individuals from other countries are trying to take advantage of people or organizations. We also in our organization, as well as some of our other partners, federal and state, we have a lot of intelligence products out there that are unclassified, Anybody can read them. And we talk about a variety of different products. It's also from all the states have fusion centers, which are a mix of federal, state, and Homeland, and local partners who work on a variety of different issues ranging from counterterrorism to guns to, it depends on the state. We have only one here in New Jersey. California has 6. It just depends on the state. And we also have something called New Jersey Shield Program, which is a portal of online information that is connected to a network to several other states, as well as 3 countries, of sharing of information on different topics, on a variety of different things. Again, it's free. It doesn't cost anything. And finally, law enforcement, there's certain things here in New Jersey that they have to take, certain things to, law enforcement agencies have to take in terms of learning about preparedness and certain types of training to help them be aware. But I know from my colleagues, who are in similar jobs as me, it's not your normal way of thinking. I don't know if I'm fortunate or not, but I came from that world, so I understand it pretty quickly. But it's just, just educate yourself as best you can. And if any of you are interested, you're more than welcome to reach out to me. I can try and get you other information that we've used with some of our partners here in the state.
Yeah, I would just add, Russ, I would emphasize there's some good analysis coming out of the Department of Homeland Security in this front. But there's been some recent work that's being done by the National Fusion Center Association, major city chiefs, major county sheriffs, where they are expanding their focus on this area of malign information operations. They're working with a variety of entities in and outside of government, and there's some really good content that's being put out there by groups like CSIS, the Atlantic Council, Institute for Strategic Dialogue. These are established organizations that have been doing a lot of work in this area globally, and there's some really good information out there that, look, I was a Homeland Security advisor in 2 states. In today's threat environment, you just have to find a way to be aware of how these information operations are conducted, because there's no area under the responsibility of Homeland Security that isn't affected by a government or non-government entity engaging in these information operations.
Great point, John. Thank you.
So Russ, there are 2 areas I would just emphasize. One is there has been better, and I think we can continue to get better, declassification of information. There's a pretty good National Intelligence Council report that the Director of National Intelligence, Haynes, declassified recently on cyber operations enabling expansive digital authoritarianism, which was mostly Chinese and Russian actors. Also did add, I think, the Iranians and the North Koreans. That was pretty explicit on their activity online, not just for cyber espionage, but for influence operations, including in the U.S. homeland. There's been more of that's been declassified, and John's right. I mean, there actually is a fair amount of open source information along these lines. It is not a coincidence that in the days before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Ukrainian government reached out to, and they'd already been working with Microsoft for cyber defense. Microsoft has also put out a range of publications on malign influence of foreign actors, including inside the U.S., as has Google and FireEye and a number of other for-profit companies, as have a number of nonprofits and research institutions as well. So I think in this arena, with probably the exception of very sensitive GRU, SVR, MSS, Russian Chinese operations, and some stuff that's requiring very specific signals intelligence or human, there's a lot actually of pretty good analysis out there, because there are still a range of people in the open source world, including me, that have their security clearances. So we kind of understand both sides of this.
Thanks, Seth. That's great. And so I know we've gone over on our time a little bit, and I want to be mindful of that. So before I turn it back to each one of you for a 15 to 30 second final point, if you have one, I'm going to do finally, not a commercial for my organization, but a product that is posted. It is completely unclassified on specifically the People's Republic of China's efforts to engage in foreign influence inside the United States, particularly with state and local officials and private sector. Just go to ncsc.gov and follow the link to Safeguarding Our Future Bulletins, and you'll see it up near the top. It was produced in July. It's completely unclassified and shareable, and we can put that on the resource page where this recording will be posted. So with that, I'm going to, John, go to you first. 15 seconds of final points.
Look, I'm often called the voice of doom. Let me just say there are reasons to be optimistic. I mean, sessions such as this, where you have folks like Lori and Seth talking about the complexities of the threat environment, we're starting to see greater cohesion between not only federal, state, local security and law enforcement, but also with key non-government entities. The good news is that we really do understand this threat environment. Now the challenge is just incorporating that knowledge into our operational protocols.
Appreciate the upbeat note, John. Lori?
First, I want to just tell John, he's not the only one who is known as Debbie Downer. Some of my colleagues in the cabinet, and even, we generally, I'm not the woman with the good news. I try to find as many success stories as I can. I would just say, I'm really glad I had the opportunity to be here to share, what's going on in New Jersey. Every state's a little different. I would echo what both John and Seth have said throughout this. Partnerships are key. We do understand this threat environment, and it's just state and local, it's partnerships are going to help you, and educating yourself to try and be the first preventers as well as first responders, depending on the situation.
Thank you, Lori. And finally, Dr. Jones.
Yeah, just want to reinforce one issue that has come up in spades that we spent time talking to the DHS secretary about. I know we talk a lot about, and I teach in a program that is Homeland Security and Homeland Defense, but the lines have long since gone away between what's happening internationally and what's happening within the homeland. So almost everything we're dealing with right now is a blur between homeland activity and that's happening elsewhere in the world, whether it's virtually or in person. So that is just the world we live in.
Thank you, Seth. Great exclamation point for this session. And we could talk for hours and hours and days probably, but with that, I'm going to thank each one of you again. You've got such distinctive backgrounds, very helpful to this. I want to thank all of you for joining us today. And finally, thank Dawn and the whole Center for Homeland Defense and Security team. And turn it back over to you, Dawn.
Russ, thank you to you. And again, thank you to our panelists for joining us today. We invite you back in upcoming weeks as we continue our America in Transition webinar series discussing what leaders need to know in 2023. Next week's panel will consider the ever-changing natural hazard environment and what that evolution in climate and environment means for local and state leaders. And several of you asked questions today about cyber. 2 weeks from today, we'll also, in the next part of this series, talk about cybersecurity threats and what state and local leaders can do to confront those. Thank you again for joining us today, and we look forward to having you with us in the weeks to come.